What's bloody good, y'all? Jacksistential back at it again with another video. Today, I thought we'd go a little bit into Catholicism and, most accurately, the progression of Catholic views towards workers' rights. And especially with this year's coronation of the new Pope Leo XIV, I believe it is worth looking at what is inspiring his theology and his views of social equality, because it is not unfounded in the Catholic Church, these ideas of social justice. Social justice is, of course, kind of an age-old Christian value. Well, at least not quite in the modern sense, but historically speaking, very much concerned with social welfare, you know. So we have here a part of the blog of the Catholic Labor Network, where they talk about the various documents by the papacy, not plural papacies, because there's only one papacy in the Universal Church, according to the Catholics, by the various popes since the late 19th century and moving on to the early 21st century. So, six key church documents addressing labor. Catholic principles of social justice are as old as the gospel and the church itself. Catholic social teaching on the rights of workers, and specifically on their right to organize in labor unions, has been clear, consistent, and explicit for more than a century. These six documents are required reading for anyone who wishes to understand Catholic social teaching on labor. So, starting at number 1, the Rerum Novarum. Nice. From 1891, this encyclical letter by Pope Leo XIII is often considered the founding document of modern Catholic social teaching. Alarmed at industrialization and laissez-faire economics were becoming the occasion of great injustice and misery for the working classes, the Holy Father called on the faithful to, quote, save unfortunate working people from the cruelty of men of greed, who use human beings as mere instruments for money-making. It is neither just nor human so to grind men down with excessive labor as to stupefy their minds and wear out their bodies, end quote, from Article 42, I believe, of this document. So Leo argued that the worker's right to a living wage took precedence over the free market. Quote, wages, as we are told, are regulated by free consent. Nevertheless, there underlies a dictate of natural justice more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man, namely, that wages ought to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. If, though necessity or fear of a worse evil, the working man accept harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice. So Articles 43, 45, end quote. He argued against the laissez-faire ideology, stating that, quote, if employers laid burdens upon their workmen which were unjust, or degraded them with conditions repugnant to their identity as human beings, finally, if health were endangered by excessive labor, or by work unsuited to age or sex, in such cases, there can be no question but that, within certain limits, it would be right to invoke the aid and authority of the law. End quote. Article 36. He also endorsed the formation of working men's unions, arguing that it, quote, were greatly to be desired that they should become more numerous and more efficient, end quote. So, 40 years later, 1931, of the document Rerum Novarum, Pope Pius XI reaffirmed and elaborated its teaching. Pius expressed continuing concern about the unjust distribution of wealth, asserting that, quote, the distribution of created goods, which, as every discerning person knows, is laboring today under the gravest evils due to the huge disparity between the few exceedingly rich and the unnumbered propertyless. It must be effectively called back to and brought before conformity with the norms of the common good. That is social justice. End quote. Article 58, I believe. I'm not sure if these are quotations of articles or just quotations of sentences. They might just be the quotations of the sentences, in which case I shall not mention them at the end of the quotations any longer, because they were not even quoted in his original document, because they are his original document. Against those who continued to advocate the laissez-faire state, he insisted that social regulation of the market was essential to justice and the common good. Quote, just as the unity of human society cannot be founded on an opposition of classes, so also the right ordering of economic life cannot be left to a free competition of forces. For from the source, as from a poisoned spring, have originated and spread all the errors of individualist economic teaching, end quote. So finally, the Holy Father explained in some detail the idea of subsidiary and its application in society. Quote, the supreme authority of the state ought therefore to let subordinate groups handle matters and concerns of lesser importance, which would otherwise dissipate its efforts. Thereby the state will more freely, powerfully, and effectively do all those things that belong to it alone, because it alone can do them, directing, watching, urging, restraining as occasion requires and necessity demands. Therefore, those in power should be sure that the more perfectly a graduated order is kept among the various associations, in observance of the principle of, quote, subsidiary function, the stronger authority and effectiveness will be the happier and more prosperous the condition of the state. End quote. All right, so that was 1931, just before the church had to sign a subservience pact with Hitler and Germany. But that eventually went away, and now we get to the mid-60s. Gaudium et Spes. I wish I learned Latin. Anyhow, this would have been at the time of Pope Paul VI. So after Holy Scripture itself, the statements of an ecumenical council are the most authoritative of all church documents. The council declared that the right to form labor unions without fear of retaliation is a basic human right. Quote, among the basic rights of the human person is to be numbered the right of freely founding unions for working people. These should be able truly to represent them and contribute to the organizing of economic life in the right way. Included is the right to freely taking part in the activity of these unions without risk of a reprisal. End quote. Yeah, so that's a decree from the Catholic Church itself that is now baked into Catholicism. So, moving on, about 16 years later, in 1981, Laborum Exercens is written, on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Pope John Paul II revisited the themes laid out by his predecessors, devoting a substantial section of his encyclical to, quote, the importance of unions, end quote. The Holy Father observed that the, quote, experience of history teaches that organizations of this type are an indispensable element of social life, end quote, and that they serve as, quote, a mouthpiece for struggle of social injustice, end quote. He clarified further the right to strike. Quote, workers should be assured the right to strike without being subjected to personal penal sanctions for taking part in a strike. So, 5 years later, economic justice for all. America's Catholic bishops issued this, quote, pastoral letter on Catholic social teaching and the U.S. economy, end quote, to help our nation's faithful think through the implications of Catholic social teaching for our social and economic life. While the world measures economic success in the number of goods produced, the bishops remind us that Catholic teaching would hold instead, quote, the most urgent priority for domestic economic policy is the creation of new jobs with adequate pay and decent working conditions, end quote. They noted that although, quote, Catholic social teaching does not require absolute equality in the distribution of income and wealth, end quote, it entailed, quote, a strong presumption against extreme inequality of income and wealth as long as there are poor, hungry, and homeless people in our midst, end quote. The bishops defended the right to organize in the strongest terms and called for labor law to reform and to better protect that right. Quote, the church fully supports the right of workers to form unions or other associations to secure their rights to fair wages and working conditions. No one may deny the right to organize without attacking human dignity itself. Therefore, we firmly oppose organized efforts such as those regrettably now seen in this country to break existing unions and prevent workers from organizing. Migrant agricultural workers today are particularly in need of protection, including the right to organize and bargain collectively. U.S. labor law reform is needed to meet these problems, as well as to provide more timely and effective remedies for unfair labor practices, end quote. Nor did the bishops exempt the church from these obligations of social justice. Quote, on the parish and diocesan level, through its agencies and institutions, the church employs many people, it has investments, it has extensive properties for worship and mission. All the moral principles that govern are just operation of any economic endeavor applied to the church and its agencies and institutions. Indeed, the church should be exemplary. We bishops commit ourselves to the principle that those who serve the church, laity, clergy, and religious, should receive a sufficient livelihood and the social benefits provided by responsible employers in our nation. All church institutions must also fully recognize the rights of employers to organize and bargain collectively with the institution through whatever association or organization they freely choose, end quote. All right, well, lastly, Caritas in Veritate from 2009, under the tenure of Pope Benedict XVI, writabouts. Catholic thinkers in the United States, seldom elsewhere in Christendom, who oppose labor unions can frequently be heard asserting that church teaching on unions applied only to the conditions at the start of the Industrial Revolution. In this encyclical letter, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI addressed this error directly. Quote, Through the combination of social and economic change, trade union organizations experience greater difficulty in carrying out their task of representing the interests of workers, partly because governments, for reasons of economic utility, often limit the freedom of the negotiating capacity of labor unions. Hence, traditional networks of solidarity have more and more obstacles to overcome. The repeated calls issued within the Church's social doctrine, beginning with Rerum Novarum, for the promotion of workers' associations can defend their rights. Quote, through the combination of social and economic change, trade union organizations experience greater difficulty in the negotiating capacity of labor unions. Hence, traditional networks of solidarity have more and more obstacles to overcome. He repeated calls issued within the Church's social doctrine, beginning with Rerum Novarum, for the promotion of workers' associations that defend their rights, must therefore be honored today even more than in the past. End quote. This was written by Clayton Sinyai of the Catholic Labor Network. Well, there you have it. Social justice is not unfounded within Catholic Church doctrine. Traditionalists would rather say, or at least not even traditionalists, but political conservatives, more or less, would prefer to dismiss the fact that the Catholic Church absolutely professes social justice and urges Catholics to fight for social change, except with the exception of the sexual revolution. Economically speaking, socialist ideals are completely founded within the Gospels. Jesus telling the rich man to give away all of his worldly possessions so that he may find the treasures of heaven. There you go. Now, on to this new Pope, Leo XIV, Robert Prevost, as he was known in his past life as a cardinal, an American cardinal, going around the world and ministering the poor and very rough and tumble neighborhoods in Chicago and Peru. So, yeah. This is on Forbes, and this was written back in May of this year. It says, why the new Pope could be the most pro-worker in a century. Interesting. As if Pope Francis wasn't already talking most about social issues rather than church doctrine. Leo, there he is has in the past spoken about the need for workers' rights, the need for the rights of migrants, legal or not, in the United States, and amongst other things, the need for people to be vaccinated against COVID for the sake of their health and their economic means. Let's look at some of what Leo says about workers and the Catholic Church. So, former missionary in the slums of Peru, Augustinian, and if his chosen name is any indication, he's aligning himself with one of the boldest traditions in Vatican history, defending labor in the face of capital. So, More than a century ago, Pope Leo XIII issued Rerum Novarum, as we previously read, or at least touched upon. It was the Church's groundbreaking endorsement of workers' rights. So, with global inequality surging and tech-driven capitalism reshaping work itself, the arrival of a new Pope Leo could not be more timely. This pope, unlike many political leaders, may be ready to speak the one word billionaires fear: justice. Now here's the thing. The new pope is also a White Sox fan. That is the most useless piece of information I've ever seen. Rooting for the South Side of Chicago likely means that you have an innate love of the underdog. It's a working class identity, a sign of loyalty to the neighborhoods that are often overlooked. That small detail tells you something deeper. This pope, like his namesake more than a century ago, may be stepping into an age-old fight between capital and labor, not as a neutral party. Helping the poor and downtrodden is central to Catholic teaching, a mission Pope Francis elevated, but Pope Leo XIV could take it further. The Vatican swapped a Jesuit for an Augustinian. If the Jesuits are intellectual heavyweights, political, philosophical, and global in scope, then Pope Francis was the embodiment of that tradition. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Prevost, comes from a different spiritual lineage. Not only is he a Chicagoan, he's an Augustinian. Augustinians are mendicants, like Franciscans, Dominicans, and Carmelites. These are orders built around vows of property and service. They don't stay cloistered. They embed in cities. They preach, teach, and minister in the thick of life among those most in need. The Augustinian tradition is rooted in the teachings of St. Augustine of Hippo. He is my, this author's confirmation saint. His influence on Catholic thought, especially around grace, justice, and community, is hard to overstate. Prevost led the Augustinians globally for more than a decade. He lived for nearly 20 years in the slums of northern Peru. His spiritual DNA reflects that legacy. Radical humility, deep contemplation, and a theology that demands action. His papal name, Leo, is no accident. So, 1891, Leo XIII issues Rerum Novarum, which means of new things, as we didn't mention before, but that's what Latin means, and I wish I had known that before. One of the most important encyclicals in Catholic history, it was the Church's first formal stance on the dignity of labor. It affirmed the right of workers to unionize and laid out responsibilities for both capital and labor. So, Leo XIII wasn't a Marxist, but he did rail against capitalism when it was unmoored from ethics. It's hard to imagine the labor movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries without the Church's shift in doctrine. In fact, the Church has long been more progressive on labor than most American politicians, especially conservatives. Rerum Novarum didn't merely permit unions, it encouraged them. When workers organize to protect their wages, health, and dignity, they are in moral alignment with Catholic teaching. Nearly every pope since has reaffirmed that message. Pope John Paul II backed the Solidarity movement in Poland. Pope Francis spoke often about the exploitation of labor in the U.S. Many mainstream politicians treat unions as corrupt relics of the past. The Vatican hasn't wavered. To pope after pope, labor organizing is a human right. In Catholic social teaching, the picket line is sacred ground. Now, Leo inherits a world with new robber barons. Not steel magnates or railway kings, but algorithmic overlords and private equity firms. They have burrowed deeper into the worker's psyche than Carnegie could ever. So, into this moment steps a pope from the South Side, formed in the tradition of St. Augustine. Habemus Papam, we have a pope who believes in common goods and communal living. Habemus Papam. We have a pope who has already signaled openness to ideals like debt relief and land rights, even saints preserve us reparations. Lately, this author has been claims to be obsessed with the Gilded Age, its modern parallels. The first Pope Leo faced not the first Pope Leo, because he was the 13th Pope Leo. The 13th Pope Leo faced the Industrial Revolution, and this one faces the collapse of the most recent social contract. The poor remain disposable, perhaps more so now. I think this author is referring to the AI revolution that is occurring right now. So, if papal names are ever arbitrary, then Pope Leo XIV's name is a reminder. The Church's job is to not just pray over suffering, but to stand with those who suffer and fight with and for them. So yes, the new Pope is thankfully a White Sox fan. But more importantly, he is a Leo. He is Augustinian. And if he follows through on the promise of his name, he could be the most consequential Pope in a century. That is, if he remembers that Jesus flipped tables. Now, this author is right about that. Jesus lashed out against the merchants in the temple. What more needs to be said? This is, why make the home of your father into a strip mall, essentially? But that last bit of information is what many capitalist Christians like to forget. They like to glaze over. Now, I'm not saying that capitalist Christians don't exist. They do, and they technically shouldn't, because if your endeavor in life is to make money, then you're not going to be a very good Christian, especially in the eyes of Jesus in the Bible. So, there you have it, folks. Pope Leo XIV is, by all accounts, a progressive theologian and, well, politically progressive, but he might very well be progressive in the doctrines of the church as well. So, that's it for today. See ya.